Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
This recording takes place online in the era of safe physical distancing. Our guest today is Bob Campbell. Bob Campbell is a writer based in Flint, Michigan. His creative nonfiction and essays have appeared in Belt Magazine, Forge Literary Magazine, and Gravel Magazine. He is a contributor to Belt Publishing's Midwest Architecture Journeys, published in October 2019. Bob was a staff writer for the Flint Journal, Lexington Herald-Leader, and Detroit Free Press. He was also an electrician at AC Sparkplug, formerly a division of General Motors, before moving into journalism. His debut novel, Motown Man, was published by Urban Farmhouse Press in October 2020. Welcome, Bob Campbell.
Thank you.
So congratulations on your debut novel. You've previously authored essays, creative nonfiction, and print journalism for 3 newspapers. How did the process of writing a novel differ for you?
Oh, well, I think that, being a journalist, you work from the inverted pyramid. Everything's up top and it kind of flows down through the funnel. So whereas with writing a novel, the story, evolves over time. And so you aren't giving away everything in the lead and then backfilling it. It's quite the opposite. So that was certainly a big change for me. The other part of it too is, in being a journalist, you sort of get that adrenaline rush of seeing your work published the next day or the next couple of days. Whereas this is a much, much longer process. The wait is much longer, and and often too, when you're doing a news story, it's a one draft or maybe 2 drafts and it's out the door. Whereas in writing a novel, there were multiple. You get your first draft done, you think you're done, and you realize that no, there's a lot more work yet to be done, a lot more changes to be done. So I guess sort of to roll it all up, the instant gratification is is non-existent. Writing the novel versus writing a newspaper article.
Earlier in your career, you were an industrial electrician. How did your transition to journalism come about from that career? Had you always been interested in writing throughout your life?
Actually, yes. I didn't realize it at the time, but I sort of stated this way, in that when I was in school, I always liked doing research papers and things of that sort, and I always much preferred an essay exam versus a multiple choice or math. So, but it wasn't anything that I thought critically about. I wasn't a huge reader. I like comic books, but the comic books that I liked were more like the Archie comics more so than the Marvel comics, because I like the story, I like the relationships part of it. But to go back to your earlier question, so in being an industrial electrician, particularly when I was a maintenance electrician, meaning that you would go out and fix things that broke down, you'd go out and when you're talking with the job setter or the operator of the machine, you're sort of asking the types of questions that a reporter would ask. What happened? When happened? When did it happen? Why do you think it happened? What is it supposed to do? Those kinds of things. And so in terms of from the information gathering and sort of kind of understanding the scene, there were a lot of similarities. But instead of fixing the machine or fixing the problem, as a journalist, you go back and write about it and let someone else fix it. But a lot of the information gathering techniques, I think there are some similarities there.
Hearing the title of your novel, Motown Man, Somebody might naturally assume that it's set in Detroit or that the lead character, who's an automotive engineer, is from Detroit, but neither of those assumptions would be true. The conversation between characters from which the title's drawn explains what the term Motown Man really means. Without giving too much away, can you share anything about how you arrived at the title?
Yeah, so part of the Motown Man is a social novel, so it explores, race is a significant theme in the book. Motown as a music, I think it had a very wide appeal that cut across, races, age groups, and so forth. And I think it's particularly resonant for a certain population, the baby boomer population, of which I consider myself sort of at the tail end of the baby boomer. So in the process of this conversation between characters, one character is saying to the other, he's kind of making some, he's kind of characterizing the state of American society, to sort of leave it there. And he sort of arrives at this description of a character as being a Motown man. And for most of the time that I was working on the book, I had a very different title. And it didn't, it worked and I really liked it. I won't reveal it, but I liked it. But in some ways, as the book evolved, it no longer seemed to fit the theme of the book. And as I was sort of, kind of reviewing the copy, reviewing the draft, and I'm going through this conversation, it just kind of hit me. I was like, that's it. That sort of speaks to the broader themes of the story.
Some of the most beautiful aspects of this book are your vivid, gritty, poetic descriptions of factory life or plant life in Buick City. And you describe Buick City as a place where the American dream was crumbling and rusting away, a city so far removed from its glorious and arrogant past when it made America go places. Could you tell us how you arrived on this setting, which is not Detroit nor Flint, nor any city that actually exists?
Yeah, it's based very much on the city of Flint, even though it's not Flint per se. But growing up here and sort of observing and understanding the city's history, particularly as you came out of the Second World War and this amazing prosperity that resulted from our victory in the Second World War, places like Flint, Detroit, other places being because of this arsenal of democracy. And so that created this huge amount of wealth for ordinary working class people. But then as the 20th century wound down, significant changes were taking place, particularly in an industrial standpoint with, the invasion of foreign, quote unquote, invasion of foreign automobiles and, the changes in factory life and how work was being done, that it really affected the psyche of, I think, the larger public in communities like the community that exists in Motown Man. So I was trying to kind of capture all of that history very succinctly.
Speaking of setting, your book is very specifically set in an unseasonably cold week in November in 1991. Why was it important for you to take the story to take place in that era and that time?
One of the challenges in writing Motown Man, I really learned how to write a novel. So one of the challenges was finding a vehicle by which to sort of transport the story. And it was a number of things that all fell into place. But it felt to me that it was kind of story that needed to be told sort of quickly, and I'm kind of rambling a little bit. So I apologize, but I'll use the example of Ian McEwan is one of my favorite authors, And one of his books that I really enjoyed was Saturday, a story that literally takes place in one day, but it's a 250-page book. So there's a lot of backstory that helps to sort of drive the narrative. And so that was sort of the same kind of thinking there, in that I was really trying to, there was these little interactions, these little occurrences that occur, I think, in daily life, that while on the surface, they may seem minor, if not trivial, but can have such huge implications, or there is so much that can go into, this moment. So that was part of how I arrived at sort of telling the story over the course of the week. And as I was, researching different aspects of it, that particular week really seemed to fit the narrative. And there's some things that happened later in the story that kind of helped to kind of tie it all together.
Motown Man explores relationships like family relationships and even an interracial romance, but also issues of race and racism. There's even diversity training that happens in the novel. And it raises the question of, can there be such a thing as a colorblind society? There's been a resurgence of interest in that topic in 2020. Have you seen any evidence that readers are engaging with this book a little differently than they might have a year or two ago?
Well, it's interesting to say that. And before I say that, because we're still waiting for it to actually be released, I can't answer that fully. But I will say that even though the story is set in the early 90s, 1991 to be exact, I do think that there are some themes that are very much contemporary, some of which you touched on. Diversity training, which is part of this, the important part of the story. Well, that's certainly being talked about now. Of course, it's called bias training. And today, things like, there have been episodes of prominent people who've been caught in blackface. There's an episode, there's a scene in the story that deals with a kind of a blackface example. So to a certain extent, while I didn't write this book yesterday or last year, I'm pleased or intrigued to a certain extent how certain themes are still resonant today. I hope the readers will feel the same.
I think that it's going to lead to some great conversations. It's the kind of book that really is a perfect book to read at this point in history. So I hope that lots of book clubs take it up and that people really find an interest in it.
Thank you.
So what's your next project now?
Well, it was funny. I was reading an author interview just last week, and the author talked about how in working on the project, he writes about 100 pages a year. And it was sort of great to kind of hear that. And when in saying that, I think what he meant by that, you get sort of 100 finished pages for a year, which it was really helpful to hear that, because me and just kind of understanding the process. So having said that, I actually have a couple of different ideas I'm kind of gathering string on. I've kind of outlined some stories, but it's the kind of thing where I haven't really sat down and say, okay, chapter 1, and and here I am. But it's more a matter of kind of outlining certain segments of the story. It's like, okay, I think at this point, this kind of makes sense. And at this point, in Act 2, we can move into this stage, and Act 3 might resemble something like this. But something I did learn in the course of writing this story, and I think this sort of goes back to my training as a journalist, and that is, and even in being an essayist, and that is, I kind of have to write with an end in mind. That's not to say that the ending won't change or be revised, but I kind of have to know what I'm aiming at, if that makes sense. It's even like when you're going on a road trip and you have some time to get there. So you get your map out and you plot your course. Over the course of your drive, it may change. You may take a detour here or there, either by design or because there's road construction and you have to take a different route. But but you still know where you're trying to get to. And I kind of, that's my approach in writing, in that even with a couple of the projects that I'm envisioning, I have sort of an end in mind. And so now I'm starting to trying to work backwards from there. And, it's, discipline is always a thing with writers, right? And finding the time to do that, to really allow yourself to get into this different space, to really allow your imagination to work, sometimes takes time. I had this professor, this instructor in school, college, who said that, when she writes, she bleeds. And I know what she means now. and I sort of knew it back then, but I really know now that it takes time to really be able to step back and put yourself in this different state of mind, and to really immerse yourself in this different reality that you're trying to create. And sometimes you can kind of get in and out of it easily. And other times you've got to really pull yourself away and say, okay, no, I've got to really get into this character. You really get into this scene.
We'd love to hear a passage from your book in your voice. Would you like to share a reading with us?
Sure. This is a section. Here's an excerpt that takes place earlier in the novel. It's a plant scene. I will begin with this excerpt of Motown Man. Beat. Jim rolled up quickly behind Bradley out of nowhere. The engineer turned to greet the skilled trades foreman just as the three-wheeled industrial strength golf cart rolled to a stop. Hop on, I'll give you a lift. Thanks. Yeah, sure, said Jim, who jammed a burning cigarette with a quarter-inch of ash back into his mouth. The years of nicotine, caffeine, and restraining his enlarged impatience had tanned his raspy foreman's voice. Bradley stepped aboard and sat down on the rear seat, back to back with the trade's boss. The yellow scooter jerked forward under Jim's quick acceleration, and they became two heads of the same coin rolling down the aisle. For the rear-facing Bradley, it was as though he was now traveling backwards through time. A trades boss needed transportation to keep up with his crew, whose millwrights, pipe fitters, electricians, welders, and unskilled laborers could be dispatched to any one of a dozen departments on construction projects in the plant's west end, like some kind of unchained game. Though a millwright by trade, Jim had crossed over some time ago and went on supervision. No longer one of the boys among the blue-collar brethren, he traded a white shirt and became just another suck-ass foreman. Jim could still play the game, though. Union solidarity with its power of seniority and other levers made it easy for a crotchety journeyman to teasingly tell him to go to hell sometimes, especially if the company was being stingy with overtime. But to those tradesmen caught sliding back late from lunch, who would dare laugh at the prospect of being written up, his response was resolute with fake indignation. You guys stop that laughing, because I'm the one who's got to do the paperwork, which told everyone Jim's heart was in the right place. Bradley had subbed in as a trades foreman one summer as a college intern and was familiar enough with the terrain, the hazing and all. He thought such behavior fostered on independence that bordered on downright insubordination on times. A strong union made it possible. And in this one-horse town, the union was a Clydesdale. So he kept his mouth shut, mostly. Besides, Delcorp Vehicle Systems was in a fight for survival, and the great corporate mothership had begun to seriously rethink its longtime practice of keeping all the automotive supplier business in the family. Rumors had become the plant's chief product and were churned out regularly about how the plant was destined to be sold, spun off, closed, or dynamited. Other companies could make the same products and components for much less, and they weren't unionized. So their wages dropped lower and workers didn't tell their foreman to kiss their ass, jokingly or not. Without question, the union was a thorn in the company's paw, forcing the giant beast to tread lighter. Bradley was sympathetic to the auto workers' predicament. and respected their tenacity, at least in theory. Jim chuckled, breaking the silence between the two men. As the two men scooted through the plant. He plucked the cigarette from his lips and asked Bradley if he knew some guy named Pulaski. The name meant nothing to Bradley. He's a trade superintendent, Jim said. Ha! That cocksucker can be a real prick. But he's a good guy, I guess. He went to this Halloween party the other night dressed as a black hobo. Bradley grimaced, hoping he hadn't heard what he just did. Excuse me? Black hobo, Jim laughed. Bradley contorted himself just enough to see if Jim was serious. As he did, he got a face full of factory stench, a medley of lubricants, solvents, exhaust, and mustiness, and felt the sting of cigarette smoke in his eyes. He squinted and sharpened his focus. The scooters zigzagged around fork trucks loaded with raw and finished parts, scooters driven by other suckasses, and the black and white bodies of pedestrians that filled the aisles inside the division. Yeah, said Jim, still amused. He wore black shoe polish on his face and whatnot, and I guess he couldn't get much of it off come Sunday morning, so he couldn't go to church. His voice was loud over the factory din and the rushing air, his amusement undeniable. And except for the churning sounds of factory life, the men were again separated by silence. The scooter raced on before stopping in the spark plug fabrication area near Bradley's cubicle. Thanks, he said, hopping off. Yeah, sure thing, buddy. Jim turned and proceeded to drive off. He had traveled a short distance before stopping again after hearing Bradley shout, "Hey!" Jim turned and saw the young man motioning for him to stop. He threw the scooter into reverse and backed up slowly. "Hey, let me ask you something." Bradley stepped toward Jim, meeting him before the scooter had come to rest. Yeah. Jim's reply was quick, with manufactured cheerfulness. Were there any black people at that party? There, he'd said it. There was no taking it back now. He didn't want to. His words struck like a brick through a plate glass window separating the inside from the out. With the slightest arch of his eyebrows and a half-cocked, mirthless smile stretched thin across his lips, Bradley's cool expression said, well, appearances can be deceiving. Though something of a late bloomer physically, the once college boy now stood a shade over 6 feet with a lean build, but his heart now throbbed in his throat, and he felt the awakening of dormant butterflies in his stomach. Jim was rough-hewn in manner and dress, with small rump roast for forearms. The foreman was built like a rook, but the engineer was braced with resolve. Bradley swallowed slowly to control his breathing, push his heart back down into its anatomically correct position. Jim's back stiffened, his expression flipped. He cleared his throat, his right eye twitched as a crimson tide washed over his fat head and thick neck. Jim's big hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as though he were trying to negotiate the bends of a dangerous stretch of highway. No, I don't think so. I don't know, really. I wasn't there. The words tumbled from his lips. Another guy told me about it this morning, but he didn't say anything about any black guys being there. Bradley hung on the way Jim said blacks. That subtle emphasis on the acts by some whites. The speaker gagging on its mere utterance, the enunciation signaled a thinly veiled contempt for its racial connotation. It was choked out in statements like, you black guys have big cocks, and black son of a bitch. Hey, Jim chuckled, hope I didn't offend you or nothing. I didn't mean anything. And he shrugged as if to say, oh, well, fuck it. He reached for a crumpled package of Merit cigarettes in his shirt pocket. Bradley's face smiled before he spoke. I was just curious. Any thoughts of a rumble right there on the dirty factory floor dissipated quickly. There would be no blows exchanged because otherwise reasonable men don't have fistfights at work, unlike on TV. The disappointment each man felt was palpable by the brief, awkward silence that followed. No, there would be no blows exchanged, but there would be no communion either. And each man prepared to leave with what he carried. Well, thanks again for the ride. Sure thing, pal, said Jim. Bradley turned and strode towards his cubicle, and the foreman scooted away in the opposite direction. Bradley's coat dangled on a hanger on the wall of his cubicle. The makeshift closet also included a hat rack for those days when he wore a brim and a small vanity mirror, which he faced. Tearing at his tie, he fumed about the black hobo costume and at the superintendent, a fucking unclassified salary employee, for his audacity. The nerve to hurl such insults. What did God say after he created blacks? Oops, I burnt one, and expect shared laughter and camaraderie to ensue. Yet to deny the blue collar select, or any of those motherfuckers for that matter, of what some considered their birthright was to risk exile to the land of darkness, exempt status stripped along with one's latitude, such as it existed. The holiday privileges revoked as Martin is transmuted into Malcolm. Bradley had bitten his tongue so often, it felt as though he had scar tissue for taste buds. People like his brother were far less forgiving. Still, was this the price of his modest success, his willing to go along, his so-called tolerance of such folly? Mastering that way of being present and accounted for without really being there? All of him, that is? No, not particularly. It didn't take much convincing, even if the math supported the theory of accommodation. Yes, he often found himself outnumbered, but low-key is who he was. So he rarely complained aloud. Each morning he rose, shaved, knotted his tie, and reminded himself over breakfast of what mattered most. And yet, more times than he cared to recall, this had been his reward. He was certain the guy wouldn't have worn such a costume if he thought a black person might have been present. Bradley didn't know Pulaski, but he was confident that he neither socialized nor worshiped with people like him. But why a black hobo with a counterfeit complexion, no less? He pictured how ridiculous and offensive this Pulaski guy must have looked in his Birth of a Nation getup, pitch black with pale skin encircling his white eyes, creating the illusion his eyes were bigger and bugging more than perhaps they already were. Surely Pulaski must have given his buddies a little show on Saturday night. He must have asked for a quarter or two to buy a bottle of wild Irish rose. No doubt Pulaski's cohorts obliged his little charade, and the truly generous ones probably gave him $1 if he asked them real nice like. Of course, the show wouldn't have been complete without an expression of faux indignation by some asshole who wondered aloud why the black bum didn't get a job and quit relying on handouts from the working man. If he wanted to be a truly funny black man, why not Richard Pryor? Anything just to demonstrate we could laugh together, that it wasn't anything so negative, so personal. But it was personal, Bradley concluded. That's why he did it. And of Jim, he thought, yeah, fuck you too. What did Jim expect? That they would share a laugh and instantly become boys allied against that cocksucker Pulaski? There was no hint of shame or embarrassment in his retelling. It was an axe wielded as some kind of imaginary payback. Payback for having to hire more blacks in skilled trades. Payback because the plant in the city seemed to be dying a slow and painful death. And people, it seemed, and white people, it seemed, those like Pulaski and now Jim, felt they needed a face, a black face to blame. All of the above. Bradley chuckled and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and together, the two faces shared a laugh. What am I doing here? He asked.
Thank you very much for that reading. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm glad you read that passage. It was good.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones.
The second half was absolutely necessary.
Yes.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Mr. Bob Campbell, and good luck with all of your future writing projects.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.